Okay, hello everybody. Now I can actually start, it seems. Yeah, wonderful. So, welcome to Bruegel. Um, I realize it's a bit late for an event, so we welcome you twice because it's very nice of you to be here at 5, cutting, on your personal time. But I hope it's going to be worthy. And I also want to say hello to those online. And it's going to be worthy because we have Paula Subaki here. She's really an expert, not only on China, but most importantly on the global financial architecture. And Paula has written a book that I still remember on the role of the international role of the renminbi. I mean, she's really one of the best experts to talk about the topic that has brought us here today, which is China's role in the international global financial architecture. Not only that, she's written a very, very insightful report for the G7 on exactly this topic, and that's going to be the basis of our conversation, but with the beauty that we're going to go beyond the report, which you can certainly find online just by, I found it so easily just with Paula's name and that same title. But the challenge today for Paula, and I'm sure that's not a challenge for her anyway, is to put this in the context of what has happened since. And that goes all the way to, of course, Ukraine and a much more entrenched strategic competition between the US and China, and what is it in for us Europeans. So that's kind of the updated type of version of this report that we want to hear about today. And without further ado, I'm going to literally grill Paula, if she allows me, on exactly this. Starting with a very basically your key ideas on the report or of this dual track. Paula talks about a dual track of China's influence or participation, not only influence, in the global financial architecture. I want to hear, Paula, more about what you mean by that global track.
Well, thank you, Alicia, and hello and good evening. Thank you for being here. And you can see Alicia and I, we've known each other for a long time, so she's extremely nice and extremely generous with her time. And I need to say, she just she was here right this morning from Taipei. So I mean, I'm big effort for Alicia, but I'm delighted to be here and have the chance to have this conversation. And then obviously to get your feedback as well. Um, we're not going to discuss the report, as Alicia said, because the report has been out for some months now. But the question is, the question I asked myself and the team that work with this report was, is it still relevant? So it came out basically a few months after the invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and all the meltdown of the global economy. Not quite a meltdown yet, but with very, very heavy and headwinds ahead. And so it's important now that we have this war in Europe. Does it matter to talk about China and its role in the global financial architecture? And the answer is yes, and it's yes for many reasons. And let me give you the key message of the report as a way to explain why this matters. First of all, I think it's obvious, but we need to remind ourselves then the world cannot function without China. We cannot afford a fragmented world. China is the second largest economy, possibly the largest, depending how we measure GDP, is the largest exporter. So again, we cannot ignore China. It's not a small economy. It's an economy which has a systemic impact on our world. The second point, as a result of what I just said, is that China is a critical component of the international financial architecture. And it is in two ways. Is a member of the institutions, always been a member of the institutions, so the IMF, the World Bank, and the multilateral framework, but also has become recently, in the last 10 years, less than 10 years, an institution builder. And that's what I refer to when we talk about and we think in terms of two possible tracks. The other thing, China is, I said already, large economies, and economies that has grown very strongly within a relatively short time, but is also a saving nation. So there is what we call a surplus economy. So there is a lot of savings, and that really allows China to play a very important role in the delivery of one of the two public goods in finance, that is finance for development. And we have seen this in action in two ways. One is actually with the inside international financial architecture, again, within the existing development banks, but also with the creation of these two new development banks. One is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is being led by China, is based in Beijing, is the leadership in Chinese, but again, the governance is shaped and is sort of the shape on the basis of the World Bank. And the other one is the New Development Bank, which is otherwise known as the BRICS Bank, another regional development bank, or the BRICS Development Bank. So this is really where China can deploy this surplus. The other important track is the fact that there is all the bilateral flows of capital that comes from China. China now is the largest bilateral lender. You probably heard about this. Many countries in Africa in particular, but not only in Africa. Another example is Sri Lanka, that defaulted recently on their debt. They are all exposed to China as bilateral borrowers, and China's bilateral lender. So this makes the situation extremely complicated, and extremely complicated now against the background of the war in Ukraine, because again there are financial linkages that cannot be ignored, and the financial linkages are between Russia and the rest of the world, and we've seen those in action through sanctions, but also between Russia and China, and again that makes those linkages makes the whole dealing, even at the diplomatic level with the current crisis, extremely complicated.
Thank you, Paola. I'm going to go to ask a few more questions before I give the floor to all of you, but I want to remind the audience, those online, that you can ask questions on Slido by writing China. That's the name the password we've chosen for this event. But before I check, certainly without the password, no questions yet, but maybe soon, I want to go back to this dual track, which I think is very, very relevant. I think I could even call it a triple track, if you allow me, because one is I stay in the institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions that were created. I stay and I put pressure for more power, rightly so, given China's size, probably still underweighted in many, many measures of influence in these institutions. But at the same time, I create my own, but those are multilateral institutions, AIIB, or generally we call it the BRICS Bank, but New Development Bank. And they are quite different, as you rightly point out. I would say the AIIB is much more similar to Bretton Woods institutions. But in a way, both are in China, not only one, both are in China. And for the New Development Bank, interestingly, the paid-up capital of India and China is the same, Indian president, but still China exerts a huge influence. And those, however, are not the vehicles for China to use its excess savings, meaning they're small. They're small, at least when one looks at their lending capacity. They might have a lot of capacity, but they don't lend as much as one would imagine. the biggest chunk of the lending is that third track I was referring to, which is the policy banks. And this is the bilateral lending. That's where the action is. So 170 billion in Latin America in 2018, I believe, before it started coming down. I mean, that's where the action is. So yes, it is. China participates in the global financial architecture. It creates its own institutions with others because, most European countries, if not all, but Paula, you can confirm, are part of the AIB. So, it's not only China, it's really relevant for us. But the action is elsewhere. It's in the policy banks. So how, and this is in your report, transparent or intransparent that lending is, how different it is from that of multilateral institutions, whether it's the traditional or the China-made ones. I'd like to hear about the third track in essence.
The third track is very murky, is not transparent, is problematic, and is problematic because even inside the common framework that was launched by the G20 2 years ago, it's very difficult to come to some kind of resolution or agreement on that restructuring for the simple reason that these are so-called private entities. So, and that makes difficult to tackle this bilateral debt. It's the G7 found themselves in a difficult position at their last summit this year. So this was an unresolved situation. We will see what the G20 and the international community will do this week in Washington at the annual meetings. That is very much on the agenda. Now, this is it. We know there's even situations where documents are not available. They're not even available to the borrower country. So it's very, very murky. And this is contrast very much with what China is doing inside the multilateral financial architecture. So if you look at the development banks created, the two regional development banks, but in particular the AIB, lending is done, projects are done in cooperation with other banks. So it's all done by the good standard of governance. And so the question is, how is possible to move from something done so well, being a responsible stakeholder, and then go into this mess of bilateral lending? I use the word mess deliberately because it's problematic for China as well, because many of these debt or these loans are now non-performing or, kind of things that the Chinese policy bank do not want to recognize as losses for obvious reasons, but they are de facto losses, and so it's problematic. The other thing to add to this problem for China, so what I'm saying here is a problem for China, is a problem for the world, but is a problem for China, and is a problem for the debtors. So it's something that needs to be resolved. And in my report, this is one of the areas I identify as, so a sort of low-hanging fruit for cooperation and engagement. And China has shown in recent months some really small steps towards more cooperation in the areas of bilateral debt. So, for example, the Chinese got into the committee for Zambia. So there are very small steps, but it's better than nothing because it's a problem for China as well. So it's not something that we can move away from. The other problems, as you mentioned in your blog for Bruegel, your recent blog, so China, along this
developing a presence in the financial architecture, so developing institutions, bilateral, giving bilateral loans, had another important policy inside the global financial architecture, global financial system, which is the development of the renminbi as an international currency. But is the development done in the Chinese way, in a different way, because partly because China cannot open or fully open the capital account. The problem with the bilateral loans is that most of these loans are in dollars, they're not in renminbi. So again, a big push at the time of the Belt and Road Initiative was to lend, to use this, again, cooperation and loans as a way to push the internationalization of the renminbi, which happened, but not at the pace that was expected. So China exposure, and particularly the policy banks exposure, is in dollar, and that is another liability to put on the balance sheet is this bank. So it's really messy.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I absolutely. I think just to add an additional messy or angle of messiness here is that, and we did write a blog for Bruegel on the Belt and Road Initiative, showing quite scary numbers as to how much everything has dropped from lending to generally to, of course, official development assistance, to investments or mergers and acquisitions in BRI countries. Everything was kind of being brought down very quickly. And the question is why? Well, because the policy banks need to do more for China itself. I mean, that's the whole point, that the Chinese economy is decelerating. So policy banks are needed in a way to support quite a few things. Just to give you a sense, now there's a lot of rumor in the market that they're intervening to support the renminbi on behalf of the PBOC. They're also financing real estate developers because the commercial banks do not want to lend to them. So they have so many other responsibilities at the time that they're, of course, in a way, being pushed to withdraw from those countries that, by the way, now have a hard time paying. But because they need to, it's a little bit like the sudden stop story. And in fact, Carmen Reinhardt has written about the Chinese sudden stop with the idea that this rapid withdrawal from emerging or frontier markets is in itself a problem. So I guess there's so many things happening at the same time beyond the transparency issue, but also the fact that these policy banks have a dual, basically, mandate, if not triple mandate, including the RMB support. Yeah.
Alicia, if I may, just to give the impression, I don't want to give the impression that these loans happened in the last few years. They go back many, many years. And they respond to a different phase in the development of China and a different phase in the development of policies. Remember, it was going out, China goes out. It was building friends. Again, there were geopolitical, diplomatic reasons. It was a search for commodities and particularly energy. And so this stuff goes back many, many years. And even 10 years ago, there were already problems with countries like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, that had already de facto defaulted on their debt to China. And I remember several discussions in China where people was asking, we are developing countries. Why do we need to go and give support and give loans to other developing countries? But that was not a problem. Now, the problem is because the economy has considerably decelerated, because there are domestic priorities, and now the policy bank, as you said, they have the dual mandate, and now they have to find a way to help, the support the Chinese economy, Chinese companies, and so on. And some of these funds are not available because they cannot get, they can't get them back. And it's complicated at the international multilateral level because, one big question is why should the international financial institutions help countries, with programs, and then this money goes back to China. So obviously the United States is not very keen to get this kind of round payment. So it's all very, very complicated.
Indeed, that's what's happening in Sri Lanka, as you mentioned, exactly. Because, for the IMF to disburse, you need a restructuring. And if you don't, with all of the creditors, you would be doing that recycling of funds. So it's a big, big issue. I wanted to move to a thorny issue, if you allow me, and then we already have lots of questions. So, and that is Ukraine. I'd like to pick your brain on this one. I remember that the AIIB published, loud and clear that they would not lend to Russia at the very beginning. I think very early in into the months of war that we've already gone through, unfortunately. And I found that quite interesting because, it kind of sounded strange compared to the narrative. But then I thought, well, it's just logical because, as you said, it's in a way straitjacketed into the model of the Bretton Woods institutions, in particular the World Bank. But the question is, will that second track, these institutions that China has created, imagine, go beyond AIIB, the New Development Bank, where Russia is a shareholder. Of course, not as large as because there's based on GDP. So India and China are the same. Russia's less, Brazil, but it's an important shareholder. There's no European, nobody else there. Will China turn, in your view, to using, kind of out of the two newly created banks, kind of turn? Because for a long time, the darling was the AIB. In fact, I still remember Xi Jinping announcing a tiny increase in capital, like in a way to tone down, because, in a way, at the New Development Bank, China shares power with India fully. And that was a time where India-China relations were tough. So all of the weight was on AIB. Now the question is, will this change, given what's happening with Ukraine? Or in other words, is AIB too Western for the AIB to continue to receive the same attention? Western. I'm thinking because I've seen no change after this announcement. And I'm wondering whether, I don't want to say this institution will survive, but I worry about, these mixed institutions now, given what's happening geopolitically. And I wonder whether China will not push BRICS Plus. As we know, Argentina is already there. If we go a little bit further into more security, ESCO Plus, we have Saudi and Qatar already been observers. Of course, India and Pakistan already in since 2017. I mean, can China go double down on Global South and somehow change that second track to a less Western or less kind of similar to the existing ones? Partially because of Ukraine, in a way, Ukraine as a push in this direction. Just picking your brain.
Let me unpick a bit here and look at the AIB and the New Development Bank. They're similar but very different, and they're very different in the governance. So the AIB is a development bank. China is the main shareholder by far. And basically everybody else is on board. In Asia, obviously, but also the European countries, they were all, so basically those who are, that are not on board are the United States and Japan. Actually, probably everybody remembers the very irritated reaction of the US administration at the announcement that the UK had joined the AIB. So, and the AIB, again, joint projects, all very good governance, even if the China is in the driver's seat, but basically literally replicate the governance matches the one of the World Bank. So one of the recommendation in the report is for the G7, obviously with the same the European part of the G7, is to continues to support the IEB. So it is also in the capacity building at the high level of the leadership, but also in the ranks, in the joint project, and all the infrastructure, because it's a good way to engage with China. Now, and here there is no, obviously the projects are very driven by feasibility and obviously credit rating. So they are not going, the projects are going to be implemented because they make sense, and they make sense because they are due to deliver, the public goods of economic growth, infrastructure building, and so on, but also they don't end up creating a liability on the bank's balance sheet. So that is how we operate it. The New Development Bank is actually a bank where China decided and chose to be, is the BRICS bank, is what you said, is the big emerging market economies then get together, and they are all at the same level. In terms of governance, there isn't, China is formally not above the others. Then the bank is based in Shanghai, and then we know this. What happened, and that was very interesting, at the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, the New Development Bank came up with a position that would say, we're not investing in Russia because this, given the situation, given the turmoil, given the uncertainty, is an investment that cannot be, doesn't make sense, which I find it very clever. And to some extent, it tells you that China, in the end, is very practical. And there are these components say, okay, now we did this big path of friendship with Russia and with Putin, but at the end of the day, we're not prepared to risk. Maybe we can give something in terms of, a bit of liquidity in renminbi as part of this swap agreement with the Russian central bank, but we're not going to take up a big risk of, lending money, knowing then they might not come back, especially given that there is already several other difficult cases. So that, to me, is, one way you see this big declaration of friendship, and then on a practical way, the story is substantially different.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor for questions, and I have here a few, but I first want to give the floor to the audience. Is anybody interested in asking a question? No questions, silent audience, but the good thing is, oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, I haven't been for a couple of years in that region. My question is for both of you. China and South Asian countries, together with Australia and New Zealand, has signed a comprehensive trade agreement which foresees financial services in the framework. Unfortunately, European Union never includes financial services into trade agreements. So my question is why China did it. Have you seen some implication of new possibilities that was opened by this chapter of the Comprehensive South Asia Trade Agreement? Because everybody signed it in the region.
Okay, I guess you are referring to RCEP, yeah? Well, my sense is that RCEP is really a very, I don't know, maybe I'm taking, the question, but of course you can add more than surely I can. But my reading of RCEP, and I think we wrote a blog at some point here, Bruegel, is really a very, very basic in terms of, a trade agreement with, first of all, a very large transition period. So a lot of what has been agreed upon might happen in years to come, if not decades to come. That's number one. Number two, a lot of the I mean, there's still permanent exceptions in the agreement, and it doesn't really tackle things like, subsidies, state-owned enterprises like CPTPP does. So, as much as it's nice to see that it's gone all the way to services, but I very much doubt, based on even what it offers to goods, to trading goods, that will change the picture of financial integration in Asia. I think we're very far from that, if at all. And I actually can imagine that it can only get somehow even more fragmented because of what Paula said about the renminbi. There is a few countries in Asia, especially South Asia, Lao PDR, this is Cambodia. These countries are really renminbi-sized, if I may use that word, while others aren't at all. And I think increasingly, as we move on, there will be countries that may at least partially adopt the renminbi, in the sense that the renminbi will be a heavily circulating currency. But in others, maybe even, I wouldn't say prohibited, but close to that. I think there's going to be a big divide in the use, because this brings me to the digital currency, actually. But Thailand, for example, has signed a memorandum of understanding to use the digital renminbi. Hong Kong too, but many others oppose because they worry about the renminbi carving out their monetary base, basically, if they receive many Chinese tourists. So my point is that I actually feel that RCEP cannot deal with these huge questions, really, as to the use of the renminbi as a circulating currency in Asia. And therefore, I think this chapter will not go very far. Sorry. Yes. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that. Yeah. Sorry, it's... Are you talking about CIP?
Quite advanced stage, and it's parallel to European system and
yes.
American system, and it's changing financial architecture substantially. I do not want to be involved.
Well, if you don't use the mic, we can't take the question because those online cannot hear. So maybe we move on to another question. Is there any question on the floor? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I was just thinking about the recent financial turmoil that has been growing in China's domestic financial sector, and I was wondering to what extent you think that this will affect China's capability to, on the one hand, keep lending to the emerging economies of the world, and on the other hand, to which this can pose a danger, and if this danger is accounted for in the financial architecture that we were just discussing.
I leave it to Alicia to comment on the
domestic impact, because she is the expert on the Chinese economy. My expertise is on the role of China within. So I'm do macro but I'm not an expert on China. The way I answer your question is, and to go back to the financial architecture, is how can China be rescued? So what will take to the current financial architecture that we know is underfunded for the size of the world economy, and in particular for the size of China's financial sector. How will we be able to face another, let's say, global financial crisis with the epicenter in China? So 2008, global financial crisis, the epicenter was in the US. Now, let's imagine that because of this turmoil in the domestic economy, which Alicia will tell you more, what will happen? And who is rescue China? And in 2008, the G20 got together, and that was one of the best examples of cooperation in economic and financial matters, because the objective was to backstop the economy, create, stop this instability, improve the regulatory framework so to avoid further crisis. And there was a good cooperation on the ground. Then we can discuss the details, what the G20 effective enough, they could do more, but that was a great example. Let's imagine as a thought exercise, what will happen if China was in that situation. Frankly, that's why we think it's so important to cooperate, because the alternative could be very, very scary, and in particular now that we talk about this gradual fragmentation of our financial architecture. But Alicia, I leave it to you, the domestic issues.
Well, I'm going to repeat the question for those online on the payment system, and then I go back to that. So the question is, how far are we on a kind of a regional payment system in Asia, if I understood you correctly? So China has set up its own international payment system, CIPS, and this was well before Ukraine. I mean, this is not kind of a quick response to Ukraine. On the contrary, it's been in the making for a long time. It so happens that it's still based on SWIFT for international transactions, so it's not necessarily what people think, that is something that we know nothing about. That wasn't originally the idea, although there is work in progress by the PBOC to basically come up with an alternative messaging system. But the point is not so much whether it's fully alternative or not, because at the end of the day, the messaging system is only an efficiency enhancer. I mean, you can still run it without. But the point is whether having that alternative payment system to chips, not to SWIFT, but to chips, makes a big difference. And the answer is, to me, is probably welfare enhancing. You have two, and if one doesn't work, I mean, I don't see that as a major, how would I say, necessarily regionalization, because in fact, the increased payments, this is before Ukraine, are not necessarily within Asia. It's, well, you can imagine Iran, this data about, is mostly the countries that would not want to go through chips. But I'm saying it's not necessarily a regional endeavor. It's more of a China-centric additional infrastructure. And that's the way it was conceived. How that will evolve over time is, of course, to be seen. But that's, and on the domestic economy, how far, if I understand you correctly, we could be from an event that makes China epicentric in the use of the global financial architecture, I think we're far. But not because things are doing well, it's because China, in a way, is similar to Japan, if I may say. So So Japan went through a massive real estate collapse. I mean, it starting with the price of land, and the world didn't notice. Japan did notice. I mean, the world noticed what was then a very big economy, not contributing to global growth. But sorry, this was actually in the early 90s. I wrote a little op-ed, and I think it's republished on the Bruegel website on this comparison. I think two things to note from that comparison. For me, China's issues, problems, will not end up in a financial crisis, will end up in lower growth down the road. Because it's this Japanese model, is where you have excess savings, you kind of misuse them further, but you don't depend on the rest of the world. This is not Spain or even the US or UK in 2008, because there's no funding gap. Basically, it's all about how you misuse your household savings by maybe putting more money in insolvent developers, or let alone insolvent financial institutions, which was the case of Japan. But that doesn't mean that everything collapses. So I doubt we will find ourselves in the 2008 situation where China needs the global financial architecture, which doesn't mean that the lack of cooperation is not important, because China is still a major creditor. So on the other side, it still remains relevant how we design the global financial architecture. Yeah. I have quite a few questions here, but maybe I move while, just to be fair with those online. So, Paula, one is on transparency, and basically the lack of transparency, which should be a pillar for conditionality. How does that lack of transparency, in a way, I'm talking Anthony, Mrs. Bonici, affects the borrowing of African countries from China?
I'm not sure what it means that they affect the borrowing, because the borrowing has already happened. And I think the borrowing, the thing is exactly the lack of conditionality compared to the multilateral development bank.
Yeah, I think that's the question.
Made borrowing from China more appealing.
Yeah.
And an example I tend to give is when, for retail, for people, for private individuals in difficulties, those who do not have any more credit ratings, or they might want to have an easy way to get a loan, they might not go through the bank, for example, or a regulated channel, but they go through a murky channel like loan sharks, and it's exactly the same thing. Is the fact that there is no regulation, control, transparency, accountability, and so on. So what was at the time of the borrowing thought to be an advantage of being with China, then it proves difficult at the time of now, when we need to look into debt restructuring.
I think you put it very clearly. It's the lack of conditionality that pushed, which is linked to lack of transparency. Yeah, because you can afford that lack of transparency if there is a price. Because I don't think debtors necessarily benefit from the lack of transparency down the road, but they do benefit from the lack of conditionality. So in a way, it's a quid pro quo kind of behavior. Well, there's some questions that go beyond our topic, like, what would China do if Russia uses nuclear? I don't think that is necessarily solved within the, topic. But maybe, what about ESG? So maybe an interesting spin-off of what we are saying is, I'm sure that as IMF, World Bank IMF meeting started, there's a lot of pressure. We've even heard of the need for these institutions to radically change, to become basically flagship institutions for climate change. Where's China in all of this? What about China's role in it? Do we have the same flag? Don't we? And how?
Climate change and environmental sustainability is one of those areas that I identified in the report as another common ground, because China has been, particularly when China was joined the G20 in 2016, there was quite a lot of work done on sustainability, climate, finance, and obviously this is a very important topic. Now the question is the standardized reporting and how an agreement can be reached, not only with China but all the main countries around the table. Sometimes we have countries that sometimes have governments that are not particularly keen on climate, or they think is not an immediate problem, so they're more reluctant to agree on standards and even voluntary code of standards. So the problem is there, and is recognized by China, and is recognized in a way that has been so far, I would say, positive. The question for which I don't have an answer is, and is an important question, is how far are we from agreeing on common standards in ESG reporting?
Absolutely. I mean, we do have, of course, our own taxonomy. China has its own taxonomy. We have a joint taxonomy, but I think it's very hard to apply all of that to international institutions. So basically, long way to go. Any other question from the audience? Any comment? If there isn't any, I mean, there's here a couple of questions which go a little bit beyond what we've discussed on China slowing down, one more coming is conditionality matters to lender to get its money back. Do you think China is reconsidering it in light of the many restructuring process it's going through? So we go back to the previous question. So this quid pro quo. But now, learning from experience, will China become more keener on conditionality because of the potential losses? Already some incurred already, but more to come, no doubt. So will China change, in other words?
Well, again, there is quite a lot of work done on the available documents on conditionality and generally the conditions in the contracts of loan contracts between China and bilateral borrowers. One thing we know, again, based on what is available, so the majority, possibly a very large amount of documents are not available because these contracts are not made public. And then I will come to the issue about accountability also for the countries that are involved in this borrowing. But one thing we know is, again, China, there is no conditionality, but there are not even concessional loans. So there is this another difference. So we don't ask you hard questions. We don't put you down on programs, but we're not going to lend at particularly favorable conditions. That's the other thing. It's not the lack of conditionality means then these loans are extremely favorable conditions. So interest rates on average tend to be commercial. So partly because of the nature of the lenders, which are the policy banks, and the policy bank at the end of the day need to have a business model, and so they need to be solvent and they need to make a profit, so they can't really be
there is a role different from that of a development bank, a multilateral development bank. So it's and the other thing, apparently there is China, and when we say China, probably we are wrong because it sounds like one entity. In reality, there are many different entities and many different, if you like, players in this game. So we might have different also outcomes. But generally, is the policy banks prefer not to restructure the debt, not to crystallize the loss on their balance sheet. They prefer to carry on to roll over the debt because it's for internal reason, and I suspect also for political reason, it's better not to have a loss crystallized on the balance sheet. But let me go back to the issue about accountability. So the fact that we don't have these documents should be available because we're talking about sovereign debt. We're not talking about private contracts between two individuals or two businesses, which, if Alicia and I make a loan and we go into a financial contract, this is our business. We might need to be accountable to our families, for example, but we don't need to be accountable to all of you, so we don't need to disclose this document. But if a sovereign debt, accountability is very important because this is a debt that goes on the nations. It's basically something as an obligation that the government takes up for the long term. So, and everybody's involved. And so again, not having this kind of accountability is particularly detrimental for poor countries. Then they are already under a lot of pressures, and this pressure has increased since the pandemic. And they need to borrow, and they can't really, again, and they find this very heavy burden of these contracts which are not even available. But there is also some of this country, we need to acknowledge this, there is also a level of corruption that is very significant. And again, we've got plenty of examples where the vested interest in the country overlap with, extremely unfavorable loan conditions in the bilateral borrowing/lending. So, and again, accountability is very important. And the third point is about capacity. Managing the sovereign debt of a country is a skill that not many countries have, and particularly poor countries. So again, having the right people that know how to deal with these issues, they understand what the contract means, they know what the obligation they're going to sign, and what are the implications for the countries. These are all very important, and something that is less discussed when we are looking into this debt. And with colleagues in my Queen Mary University of London, we are actually running this project, and this is economists like me, but also legal experts and experts of debt restructuring, then really look in the thing and say, it's always too late. We always go into debt restructuring when it's too late. We should be able to create a good practice, good governance, so countries know what they're doing, they understand what they're borrowing, they understand the conditions, they take a long-term views, they match their long-term view also with their expectation vis-a-vis the growth of the economy, because you need to grow the economy in order to pay back your debt. So all this becomes a sort of virtuous circle as opposed to be in a spiral of bad debt.
Good kind of point to end our conversation. And if you've noticed, inevitably when we talk about China's role in the global financial architecture, we end up talking about the third track, i.e. China's bilateral lending and bilateral lending. And this is because it's so much bigger. At the end of the day, what this shows is that as much as China is humongously important, and we have the traditional institutions, the new institutions, we end up talking about what matters most, or at least more urgently, which is that bilateral lending and all of those projects that are pending, and some unfinished, some finished, but with a lot of debt out there that will need to be restructured. And I think, as Paula reminded us, this is going to be a big part of the conversation. at the IMF annual meetings, but frankly speaking, also at the G20 meeting in Indonesia, where I mean, it will be unavoidable. We avoided it in Italy because there was no consensus on the common framework, on kind of the end of the DSSI. We wrote about this at Bruegel too, but I don't think Indonesia will manage to just ride through that because more and more defaults are in the making. So that's why, in a way, although the report is much more kind of global financial architecture, we end up where we ended up in this conversation because that's the urgent part of it. So we thank you all for your interest, and welcome to Bruegel again. Thank you so much whenever you have time to visit us. Thank you. Thank you for the audience online. Thank you so much.